On May 31, 2009, at approximately 8 p.m. local time air, France Flight 447 took off from Rio de Janeiro International Airport in Brazil, heading for Paris, France. The Airbus A330-200, one of the newest aircraft in the fleet, was carrying 216 passengers from multiple nationalities, including French, Brazilian, and German citizens. The aircraft had recently undergone an overhaul and had logged 19,000 flying hours. With no reported mechanical issues, it seemed like any other routine flight across the Atlantic. The flight crew was composed of 3 pilots. Captain Marc Dubois, 58 years old, had 11,000 flight hours, including 1,700 on the Airbus A330 first officer. David Robert, 37, had over 6,000 hours, 4,500 of which were on this specific aircraft. The youngest pilot, co-pilot, Pierre-Cédric Bonin, 32, had nearly 3,000 flight hours with 807 hours on the A330. The flight was smooth initially, as the aircraft climbed to its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. However, as the flight progressed, things took a dangerous turn. At 1:35 a.m., the aircraft entered oceanic airspace over the Atlantic, where thunderstorms and tropical showers are common. The Intertropical Convergence Zone, ITCZ, a region of low pressure near the equator, was notorious for unpredictable weather. The storms in this region are difficult to detect accurately on radar, which made them more dangerous. The crew discussed climbing to 37,000 feet to avoid the turbulence, but the aircraft was already encountering mild turbulence as it entered the storm. The weather radar struggled to identify these storms properly, and the turbulence became more intense as the aircraft flew deeper into the zone. As the automated systems tried to manage the flight, the pilots were still responsible for navigating the aircraft and avoiding turbulent weather. Unfortunately, the systems failed to cope with the unforeseen conditions, leading to a loss of control. The aircraft's autopilot system, designed to handle routine flight management, became less reliable in these conditions, which set the stage for the impending disaster. This incident bore similarities to past aviation disasters like Air Canada Flight 797, which also struggled in unpredictable thunderstorms. Both flights faced difficulties navigating storms that were not visible on radar, showcasing how even the most advanced technology and experienced pilots can be caught off guard in such challenging conditions. NTSB and ICAO reports on incidents like these emphasize the importance of effective weather detection systems and pilot training to handle turbulent and hazardous weather scenarios. As the flight continued, the crew's actions would become crucial in determining the outcome of this mysterious and catastrophic sequence of events. The story of Air France Flight 447 isn't just a tale of a routine flight gone wrong. It's a reminder of the complexities involved in modern aviation, where the human element, technology, and weather conditions all play a role in shaping the fate of an aircraft. As the aircraft continued its journey through turbulent skies, the crew faced increasingly difficult challenges. The pilots, aware of the approaching turbulence, had hoped to climb to a higher altitude to avoid the storm, but they soon realized that it was too warm to do so. Warm air is thinner, which reduces the aircraft's ability to generate lift, a critical factor in maintaining flight. With this realization, the crew made a series of adjustments in the cockpit, dimming the lights and turning on the landing lights to enhance visibility outside the aircraft. The relief first officer had just returned from his rest break at 2:00 a.m., and the captain, after not providing a proper briefing, left the cockpit for his rest period. This left the first officer in the right seat as the pilot, flying the aircraft, and the designated pilot in command during the captain's absence. The first officer informed the relief first officer about the inability to climb due to the air conditions and the anticipated turbulence ahead, which was similar to their previous encounters. 6 minutes later, both first officers notified the cabin crew of the incoming turbulence, expected to last for about 2 minutes. As expected, the turbulence turned out to be moderate, but the aircraft's bank angle began to fluctuate, swinging between approximately 3 degrees to the right and 5 degrees to the left. Despite the autopilot being engaged, The crew could sense the turbulence's intensity increasing. To mitigate the turbulence, the first officer made adjustments to the weather radar gain, increasing its sensitivity. The aircraft then deviated 12 degrees to the left of its intended track, hoping to avoid the worst of the weather. 2 minutes later, the aircraft encountered a sudden updraft, a typical phenomenon in turbulent weather. A sound was heard, one that pilots often associate with ice crystals hitting the fuselage. This was an early indication of a dangerous development. The pitot tubes started picking up ice particles. The pitot tubes are responsible for measuring the pressure of oncoming air and comparing it to the static pressure to calculate the aircraft's airspeed. This data is crucial for the pilots to understand the aircraft's speed, vertical speed, and altitude, which is displayed on their instruments. However, if ice crystals accumulate in the pitot tubes at high concentrations, they can clog the tubes faster than the built-in heaters can melt the ice. The A330 has 3 pitot tubes, one for the captain, one for the first officer, and one for the standby instruments. As all 3 tubes became blocked with ice, the airspeed readings became invalid, plummeting from 275 knots to 139 knots. This malfunction triggered a series of events that spiraled out of control. The autopilot disconnected, and the flight director bars disappeared. The aircraft's flight control law shifted from normal to alternate 2, which led to the deactivation of many of the built-in flight protections, such as angle of attack, protection over speed protection, and bank angle protection. As a result, the aircraft became much more sensitive to roll inputs. The first officer, now in full control of the aircraft, struggled to regain stability. The aircraft rolled to the right, and he started to manually fly the aircraft, making nose up, and left roll inputs in an attempt to stabilize the situation. With the auto thrust disengaged, the power setting froze at 83%, and the aircraft's pitch attitude increased to 6 degrees. The vertical speed rapidly increased to 800 feet per minute, a clear warning sign that the aircraft was about to stall. A stall occurs when the wings of an aircraft can no longer generate enough lift to keep the aircraft flying, causing it to lose altitude rapidly. The first officer's struggle to regain control was only beginning. Despite his efforts, the aircraft continued to experience a decrease in airspeed, with the readings dropping sharply to 73 knots. The pitch attitude climbed further to 11 degrees, and the vertical speed reached an alarming 6,000 feet per minute. The first officer's attempts to control the aircraft became more frantic, continuously making nose-up inputs and triggering the stall warning. The aircraft was now in an aerodynamically unstable condition, and the first officer increased thrust to take off, go around toga power, in a desperate attempt to regain control. During this chaotic period, the crew attempted to call the captain back from his rest period, ringing the call chime multiple times. However, the aircraft's condition continued to deteriorate. The stall angle of attack was reached, and the aircraft began shaking violently as the situation had become critical. The first officer tried to limit his use of the lateral controls, attempting to minimize the roll inputs and maintain a shallow climb. But it was clear that the aircraft had crossed into a state of uncontrollable instability. This incident highlights a crucial failure of the aircraft's pitot tubes, a recurring issue that has been noted in other aviation incidents as well. In the case of Air France Flight 447, this malfunction triggered a series of events that overwhelmed the flight crew. The NTSB and ICAO have often pointed to the importance of backup systems and redundancy in critical flight instruments, particularly when flying through regions prone to unpredictable weather. The failure of the pitot tubes led to a loss of airspeed data, which in turn caused the autopilot to disengage, leaving the pilots with a rapidly changing situation that proved difficult to regain control of. As the aircraft continued its struggle in the night skies, the question remained: could the crew have done anything differently to prevent the tragic outcome that was rapidly unfolding? Would a more comprehensive understanding of the aircraft's systems, along with a better ability to manage severe weather conditions and instrument failures, have changed the course of this flight's fate? The answers remain elusive. But the events of this night would shape future aviation protocols and spark significant changes in how aircraft systems are designed to cope with extreme weather and unforeseen malfunctions. The aircraft's struggle continued as the first officer attempted to regain control by making full left and right stick inputs, trying to counteract the rolling motion that was becoming more intense. As the ice blocking the pitot tubes melted, the airspeed indicators began to show the correct readings, now around 180 knots. However, this was still too slow for their altitude. The normal airspeed for a flight level of 38,000 feet was approximately 260 knots, so the aircraft was dangerously underspeed, setting off a cascade of issues. Seconds later, the aircraft reached its maximum altitude of almost 38,000 feet, having gained 3,000 feet in just over a minute. This rapid ascent was a direct consequence of the autopilot disengaging, and the bank angle started to increase to the right. Despite the first officer's full input to the left stick, the bank angle remained largely unaffected. At this point, the first officer began to realize that control was slipping from his hands. The words that followed, "I don't have control of the aircraft anymore," were a stark admission of the gravity of the situation. As the relief first officer made 2 full left control inputs in an attempt to regain control, the first officer kept the side stick fully to the left, pulling it back for nearly 40 seconds. The descent rate accelerated rapidly, reaching 10,000 feet per minute. The pitch attitude fluctuated between 10 and 16 degrees, nose up, and the aircraft's situation was deteriorating fast. The struggle to control the aircraft had now entered its most critical phase. After 2 minutes, the captain re-entered the cockpit. By this time, the airspeed indicators had dropped below 60 knots, causing the angle of attack sensors to become invalid, which in turn silenced the stall warning. As the speeds continued to plummet, dropping below 30 knots, a red SPD flag replaced the airspeed indication entirely. Despite the first officer's attempts to pull back on the side stick, the aircraft was now tilting to the right with bank angles fluctuating up to 45 degrees. The cabin was filled with the voices of the crew, each struggling to comprehend the rapidly unfolding catastrophe. "What are you doing? What's happening? We're losing control of the aircraft here." In a desperate attempt to regain some stability, the thrust levers were moved to idle and the nose pitched down. Each time the nose pitched down, the angle of attack reduced slightly, and the airspeed indication briefly reappeared. The stall warning reactivated, but the first officer deployed the speed brakes, causing the nose to pitch up and level with the horizon. This temporary stability was short-lived, as the relief first officer advised against extending the speed brakes further, causing them to retract. As a result, the nose returned to 8 degrees below the horizon before pitching up again. The aircraft continued its rapid descent with vertical speeds, ranging from $10,000 to 15,000 feet per minute. The relief first officer then increased the thrust to climb power, briefly leveling the wings and indicating a straight flight path. However, this moment of stability was fleeting as the aircraft once again swayed left and right. The first officer continued to make significant movements with the side stick to counteract each roll, and the aircraft descended through 20,000 feet. As the aircraft neared 9,000 feet, the relief first officer instructed the first officer to move the side stick forward, while pulling the thrust levers back to climb power. The first officer, however, continued to pull back on the side stick, resulting in a dangerous dual input situation. The first officer insisted, "I have the controls," but the relief first officer, clearly frustrated, repeated, "You will input what you'll input." At this point, the captain, seeing the critical situation, reset the aircraft's primary and secondary flight control computers in an attempt to stabilize the aircraft. However, his efforts proved futile as the aircraft continued its perilous descent. The first officer maintained his backward inputs on the side stick, despite the relief first officer's constant attempts to intervene. The aircraft's nose continued to pitch up, reaching 16 degrees, and the thrust levers were pulled back to idle for 2 seconds before the descent continued. By the time the aircraft descended to 2,500 feet, the ground proximity warning sounded in the cockpit, signaling that the aircraft was just moments away from impacting the ground. The situation had reached its most critical point. The stall warning triggered once again, but the crew's attempts to recover control came too late. At this moment, the aircraft had lost all ability to regain stable flight. This descent sequence illustrates a series of interrelated issues, from pitot tube failure due to ice, which led to a loss of airspeed data to pilot input errors, and ultimately to the tragic breakdown of aircraft control. The NTSB and ICAO have highlighted such failures as critical learning points in aviation safety, underscoring the importance of redundant systems, manual flying skills, and clear communication during emergency situations. In this case, dual inputs from the flight crew, particularly the conflicting side-stick movements, contributed to the aircraft's inability to recover, compounding the technical challenges the pilots faced. The crash of Air France Flight 447 serves as a sobering reminder of the complexities involved in maintaining control of an aircraft in extreme conditions, where even the slightest misstep can lead to irreversible consequences. In the final moments of Air France Flight 447, the crew was desperately attempting to regain control of the aircraft, but their efforts were futile. As the aircraft pitched up to 16 degrees, the first officer pushed the takeover button on his side stick, cutting out the relief first officer's commands. This action signified the complete breakdown in coordination between the crew members. The aircraft, now uncontrollable, fell from 38,000 feet to sea level in just 3 minutes and 30 seconds. Tragically, all passengers and crew on board lost their lives, marking this incident as one of the most devastating events in aviation history. As the sun began to rise, air traffic controllers in Senegal tried unsuccessfully to contact the aircraft after it failed to check in. Despite numerous attempts, the plane remained silent. Both Brazil and Senegal activated rescue operations, but the search was complicated by the absence of radar coverage in the region, leaving no witnesses, and inconsistent radio communication. It wasn't until 2 days later that a Brazilian aircraft spotted what appeared to be an oil slick and floating debris, marking the first sign of the plane's tragic fate. A few days later, rescue teams discovered 2 bodies, along with personal belongings from the passengers. The final resting place of Flight 447 was located on April 3, 2011, at a depth of nearly 4,000 meters. By May 10, 2011, both black boxes had been recovered and sent to the Bureau d'Enquêtes et d'Analyse (BEA), France's air safety agency, for analysis. The BEA's investigation culminated in a final report published in July 2012, which identified the root cause of the incident. The investigation uncovered that the failure of the pitot tubes, caused by the accumulation of ice crystals, led to inaccurate speed readings. This malfunction caused the autopilot to disengage, and the aircraft transitioned to alternate law, which deactivated several safety systems, including angle of attack, overspeed, and bank angle protection. As a result, the aircraft became extremely sensitive to roll inputs, and the pilot struggled to manage the aircraft's pitch attitude. The stall warning, accompanied by strong buffeting, sounded continuously for 54 seconds, but the crew failed to identify the stall or initiate recovery procedures. The aircraft continued to descend uncontrollably until it crashed into the ocean. This failure to recover was attributed to a lack of specific training for manual flight handling during a high-altitude stall, despite the aircraft meeting regulatory standards. Upon reviewing the training records and check rides, it was evident that the co-pilots had not been trained in manual aircraft handling during stall approaches and stall recovery at high altitudes. This gap in training was a critical factor in the crew's inability to recover from the stall and ultimately led to the tragic crash. As a result of the investigation, the BEA issued several key recommendations aimed at preventing similar incidents in the future. These included revising training programs to include mandatory drills on manual aircraft, handling particularly during stall recovery at high altitudes. The BEA also recommended the installation of an angle of attack indicator, and improvements to flight recorders and pitot probes to enhance aircraft safety. In conclusion, the crash of Air France Flight 447 highlights the complexity of modern aviation and the critical importance of thorough training, effective crew coordination, and reliable aircraft systems. The investigation underscored the necessity for redundancy in aircraft systems and manual handling training for pilots. While no single factor fully explains the tragic outcome, it is clear that lessons learned from this incident can contribute to safer skies for everyone. If you found this video insightful, please consider leaving a like, dropping a comment, and subscribing to the channel for more aviation content. Let's continue to learn from history and ensure the safety of future flights.